Hi there, this is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, and welcome to the second episode of In the Frame, my video series that is essentially replacing top 10s, because that's too hard to do. So this episode, as you may have guessed, is about Christopher Walken. So I'm just going to show you the films I have of Christopher Walken. I don't have that many, I've only got about 43. He's had a long career. March 31st, he recently turned 77. And he's one of my favourite actors. And still one of the most underrated actors, I think. Because he has a reputation of playing heavies and villains and weirdos. People kind of lose sight of the fact that he is actually a great actor. He's certainly a unique actor. Obviously his unique line reading and vocal delivery is famous. He has been impersonated lots of times, even by other actors like Kevin Spacey and Kevin Pollak, both of whom are nowhere near the actor that Christopher Walken is. He came from kind of a musical background. He was a child performer. He loves cooking and dancing. So a few films he does get to dance. Obviously he was in the famous Fatboy Slim video Weapon of Choice, where he danced and flew around a room. So I'm just going to go through the films of his that I have, most of which I can kind of justify. There are some exceptions. Obviously he did a couple of TV shows. He was in an episode of Kojak and Hawaii Five-0, bizarrely. And then his first major role was in The Anderson Tapes by Sidney Lumet. Bizarrely, in this film he is credited as just being the kid. Obviously he has a wonderful line about wanting to eat New York. This is a fantastic film. I mean, he doesn't have a huge role, obviously, but you can already see the way his eyes move, and again his vocal delivery, that he might be somebody to keep an eye on. So then he made Next Stop Greenwich Village, which I have yet to actually watch, directed by Paul Mazursky. And again, this is another small role. Jeff Goldblum's in this as well, Shelley Winters, and Ellen Green. But I've still to watch this one. And then he appeared again in just a small role in Woody Allen's Annie Hall, where he plays Dwayne, who is a rather strange character and tells Woody Allen's character that sometimes when he's driving he wants to turn into the oncoming traffic. So again, it's another little unusual cameo. I mean, the thing with Walken, quite a lot of his films he does cameos, or he's in just a few scenes, but sometimes he's the best thing in the film. And even although it might not be a film that contains the meaning of life, it's always worth watching just for Walken. Or maybe that's just me. But then his kind of big break was The Deer Hunter with Michael Cimino, where he is perhaps not the lead, because obviously De Niro's on the cover, but certainly a co-lead. And he won for Best Supporting Actor. Again, just a great performance in one of the roles which he kind of perhaps did a niche or created a niche for, which is playing men who are hollow or have been hollowed out by trauma or don't have much life left in them. And again, with his use of his eyes and his expressions, his performance in The Deer Hunter is one of the essential Christopher Walken roles. Unfortunately, he didn't then become like a leading man, perhaps the way he looks, perhaps again his vocal delivery. So he's not a leading man in too many films, but the ones that he is are to be cherished. So I'm just going to go through these. They're not in any order, but I've got a pile of DVDs that we'll go through first. So the first one is Communion, which is a lovely little film, which I think you can get a Blu-ray of. Written by Whitley Strieber, based on apparently events which happened to him. It's just a wonderful little film about a writer who may or may not have been abducted by aliens. And again, Christopher Walken gives a wonderful kind of strange Hollow Man. I'm not just going to say Hollow Man for every single role he does, but it's a kind of really strange little performance. But again, he is the leading man, and it's just a really nice little film. Next is Biloxi Blues, written by Neil Simon, where he plays a drill sergeant. Matthew Broderick is essentially the Neil Simon character, who's fairly cynical and blasé about the war and what they're doing, and Christopher Walken is just in fine form. He's funny, he's scary. In my opinion, he's better than Lee R. Emery in Full Metal Jacket, as good as Lee R. Emery is. Walken just gives a much more rounded and three-dimensional performance as a slightly unhinged drill sergeant. Next is All American Murder, which is not which is not a great film. He plays a cop investigating a murder at a college, featuring rich kids. Again, the only reason I have this is for Christopher Walken, because he does have some wonderful moments. The film in itself is not a great film. I wouldn't particularly recommend it, but if you're a Walken fan, it's essential, as all these films are. Next is Around the Bend, which is a lovely little road movie featuring 3 generations of a family, male members of the family. Walken again is a more human performance. It's not one of his oddball roles, and it's a nice little film if you can pick it up cheap. Next is A Late Quartet with Philip Seymour Hoffman, which again is a lovely little gentle film about this musical quartet and just their relationships with each other as they get older. And it's a lovely little film about people getting older, and again, Walken's fantastic in it. Next, McBain, which is essentially the Dogs of War, but not as good. That's all I really need to say about that one. Next is Man of the Year with Robin Williams. Robin Williams plays a radio talk show host who's critical of the government and the president, so he just decides to run for president just for a laugh. And of course he gets in, and Walken is his advisor. Again, it's a funny film but with a point, and Walken's awesome in it. Next is Homeboy, a lovely grim little boxing film with Mickey Rourke, and Walken plays the dodgy promoter owner of Mickey Rourke. It's more classic Walken. Mickey Rourke's actually very good in it as well. It's a nice little film. Next is Abel Ferrara's The Funeral, which really needs a Blu-ray release. Again, let me know if it does have a Blu-ray release, because I'll be rushing out and buying that. The Funeral's fantastic. It's got a really wonderful sense of place. It's got a great cast: Christopher Penn, Benicio del Toro, Vincent Gallo. Walken again just commands the screen when he's on as the head of a crime family who's investigating the murder of Vincent Gallo, one of his brothers. Walken's just fantastic in this. It's one of Ferrara's best films. It's one of Ferrara's, or it's arguably Abel Ferrara's best looking film. It's just really nice. Obviously downbeat because it's Ferrara. Next is Robert Redford's Milagro Beanfield War, which is a lovely little film about land grabbing. And Christopher Walken plays the heavy that's brought in to kick the people off the land. Again, it's perhaps a one-note character, but Walken gives it more depth and more dimensions, just because he's Christopher Walken. And as I was saying earlier, even if he's only in a film for a few scenes or he has a smaller role, he just makes it more interesting. Again, with his line delivery, with his physical movement, his eyes, he just makes stuff a lot more interesting than perhaps sometimes it would be if somebody else was playing it. Nick of Time by John Badham, filmed in real time, with Charles S. Dutton and Peter Strauss. And Johnny Depp. I love this film. It's completely cheesy. Johnny Depp is approached by Christopher Walken, and he's pretty much got an hour and a quarter to assassinate somebody, or his daughter will die. Complete nonsense. It really needs a Blu-ray release. Christopher Walken's hamming it up like you wouldn't believe. It's one of his best moustache roles. I'll come to his other moustache roles. He's got slick back hair. He's just doing all the ticks. It's just an absolute blast. Next is another film that's a bit cheesy, but I love it, just like Ross Age. Suicide Kings. This is where he plays a mob boss that's kidnapped by a bunch of rich kids who are wanting to find out what happened to one of their girlfriends who has allegedly been kidnapped. It also stars Dennis Leary as Walken's kind of contacting the outside world while he's being kidnapped. Dennis Leary's quite funny as usual. His kind of sidekicks always criticising him for buying Stingray boots, which is actually a nice touch on how when you're in crime and you have so much money, you end up buying just stupid stuff that you would never buy normally when you were growing up, but now that you've got copious amounts of money, you just buy stupid things like Stingray boots. Walken's strapped to a chair for most of this film, but again, he's just so good the way he kind of manipulates the kids. I mean, the rich spoiled kids are quite annoying, you don't really care about them. This is all about Walken, and he's fantastic. Next is Search and Destroy, which is probably one of the worst Walken films I've got. Walken himself is fine in it, but it's just an absolute mess. It's got a pretty good cast, but it's one of those post-Tarantino films that tries to have all the quirky dialogue, and it kind of falls flat. Next, Pool Hall Junkies, which is kind of The Colour of Money, The Hustler for the Generation X, and Christopher Walken just makes an appearance as a kind of money man who decides to back the lead character. He has a couple of absolutely classic monologues, one about being a lion. There's even a joke about his hair, because he's got quite big hair in this one. Again, it's a nice wee film, not a great film, but again, Walken just elevates it. He's got a couple of just sensational scenes in it that are just... They're actually on YouTube. If you actually YouTube Christopher Walken Pool Hall Junkies, you'll probably see the best bits from the film. Next is The Prophecy Part 2. I'll get to The Prophecy when I go through the Blu-rays. Obviously, these sequels about the war in heaven between warring angels get progressively worse after the first one, and Walken is in them even less. Number 2 is okay. And Prophecy 3, The Ascent, he's hardly in this one. I think he's only in it for like 2 scenes. I think they're up to like 5 or something. Next is one that I don't actually have on bought, but Wildside by Donald Cammell. Donald Cammell's final film, which was a bit of a mess and butchered and was reshot, and it's kind of interesting. It's one of those films that you kind of watch once every 10 years. Things to Do in Denver When You're Dead. Again, probably needs a Blu-ray release if anybody knows if there is one. A great cast: Andy Garcia, Treat Williams, I Am Godzilla, New York, Japan, Bill Nunn, William Forsythe, Gabrielle Anwar. Remember when she was big in every second film? Christopher Lloyd as well. It's not on that disc. Christopher Walken stars as a crime lord, even though he's in a wheelchair with one of those tubes to move about. So he's got this creepy old wig on, so he does look quite creepy and sweaty for most of the film. And he gets Andy Garcia, who owes him a favour, to do one last job. Again, it's one of the films that probably got made post Tarantino. The writer's Gary Fleder, is it? He kind of creates his own dialogue, his own glossary of terms like boat drinks and buckwheats and give it a name. So he kind of created this language. It's kind of like a throwback to the noirs, but a bit more talky, a bit more Tarantino-esque, and a bit more violent. But Christopher Walken is genuinely creepy in this one, genuinely intimidating. It's a nice little film, which probably does require an Arrow release or something like that. Next is Turks and Caicos, named after the island. This is one of the series of films with Bill Nye as a spy. I can't remember the character name. There's kind of 3 or 4 of these films, but the reason I have this one is simply because of Christopher Walken, who plays a slightly shady, perhaps FBI agent or CIA agent, probably CIA agent. It's a lovely little film. The interplay between Bill Nye and Christopher Walken's really quite enjoyable. and it's got a nice twisty little plot. Next is a little gem, Undertaking Betty, which had a couple of different titles. This is a bizarre little film, but really quite charming. Set in a little Yorkshire town. It's about the rivalry between two funeral directors, one of which played by Alfred Molina, who's got a soft spot for Brenda Blethyn, who is married to a complete git, who's having an affair with Naomi Watts. And the other side of town, the other funeral director, bizarrely, is Christopher Walken, with even bigger hair, and his sidekick Lee Evans, who do themed funerals. So there's a really funny scene with a Star Trek funeral that goes a little bit awry. And again, it's one of those just little beautiful small British films that just came out, disappeared. Nobody, there wasn't a market for it, but it's a little gem. The relationship with Alfred Molina and Brenda Blethyn is really lovely, and it's a kind of relationship you don't really see that often with two people that are a little bit older, who've always liked each other, but just circumstances in life, they've went down different paths. And it's one of those films, again, I'm not romantic in any way, shape or form, but you do actually want them to get together. I would highly recommend it. Again, it's a film that should have more exposure because it's just lovely, and Walken just gives a hilarious performance as this outsider, but it's a really funny little film and charming. So I'll go on to the Blu-rays. Heaven's Gate, Michael Cimino's follow-up to The Deer Hunter, 216 minutes long. Again, Walken is fantastic in it, playing another hollow character. I need to rewatch it, it's been a while. But this is the second sight release, which has a bunch of extras. Heaven's Gate. Again, it's another film that's not as bad as its reputation. Again, it's just because it lost lots of money, so it's a bit of a mess, but it looks really nice. Next is a fun little film, Stand Up Guys, or with this Italian steelbook, Io Mine di Parola, with Al Pacino, Christopher Walken and Alan Arkin. I mean, if you're a film fan, what can you not like about Al Pacino, Christopher Walken and Alan Arkin? Al Pacino comes out of prison, and Christopher Walken and Alan Arkin are his old buddies, but there's a plot going on. You can probably figure it out. Again, it doesn't have the answer to the universe, but it's just a lot of fun. 3 excellent actors just having a blast, and it is a lovely little joy. Next is 7 Psychopaths by Martin Mcdonagh, who obviously went on to do 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri. This film isn't great. It's another one that thinks it's way cooler than it actually is. Again, it's got a really good cast. Woody Harrelson, Colin Farrell, Sam Rockwell, the wonderful Tom Waits turns up for a great little performance. But it's Walken who just steals the show. The other actors are doing lots of moving about and being loud and being crazy, and Walken is just like understated. And there's a scene with Harrelson which is just chilling. There's a great scene where somebody holds a gun on him and asks him to put his hands up, and he's just like, no. And the guy's like, why not? It's just like, 'cause I don't want to. It's a perfect example of when everybody else is like being loud and like show offy, Walken's actually quietly understated, and he just walks away with the film. Again, it's not a great film, it's a bit of a mess. There's nice moments in it. Yeah. Batman Returns. Bizarrely, Christopher Walken's not on the three names, which is deeply offensive. Batman Returns is probably one of the better Batman films. And Christopher Walken again plays Max Schreck. Nosferatu fans will recognise the name. Again with big hair. He's Michelle Pfeiffer or Catwoman's boss who pushes out a window. And again, he's not in the film a lot, but he's funny. He's threatening in places. And it's just a great performance by him. He knows exactly what he's doing, as does everybody else in the film. And it's just a blast. If you're kind of a little bit tired of perhaps the really serious tone of Christopher Nolan's Batman films, Batman Returns is a blast. Even though it's dark, it's more in the vein of like the 60s shows as far as the zaniness. Next is one of his all-time classics, The Dead Zone by Cronenberg. This is one where he's the leading man. Everybody knows the story. He's a school teacher about to marry Brooke Adams, beg your pardon. And then he has a car accident. He's been in a coma for years. It's one of the best Stephen King adaptations. He comes out and you can see the future when he touches people. It's so good. His performance is haunted Johnny. The ice is going to break. It's just a fantastic film. It's one of Cronenberg's best, even though it's not, pure Cronenberg, but it kind of showed people that Cronenberg could do something that wasn't like on the surface, all body horror and everything. It's quite a cold, detached film, but you're on Christopher Walken's side throughout, and you do feel bad at the end, or you should feel bad at the end. It's a great film and a great Walken performance. Next is a little gem of a film that kind of got lost again. This is The Heist, even though originally it's called The Maiden Heist. Again, the artwork with Morgan Freeman and Bill Macy and they've all got guns is just complete nonsense. They make it out as if it's a gun-toting action flick, and of course it's not. It's about three museum employees who are in love with pieces of art, and the gallery is going to send them to Denmark, I believe it is, to another museum, and they decide to take matters into their own hands to get the pieces of art that they love. For people who think Walken only does kind of scary, menacing villains, this is just a beautiful, underplayed, light touch comedy. At times it's predictable, but it's such a joy. Morgan Freeman's excellent, Bill Macy's fantastic, Marcia Gay Harden as Christopher Walken's wife. Everybody's just beautiful in it. It's a great wee film, but again, it's the perfect example of a film that was just mismarketed. There wasn't a niche to put it in, so it just got forgotten about, and then bizarrely it got released on Blu-ray as this kind of action, they've all got guns, which just doesn't happen with the exception of spoiler alert, a dream sequence. But it's such a little gem. If you haven't seen it, I would highly recommend it. Next, it's one of his best moustache performances. It's At Close Range with Sean Penn. Christopher Walken stars as a family man, but a kind of crime lord out in the Midwest, like stealing tractors and stuff like that. And Sean Penn is his estranged son who is drawn to the lure of his life. It's a lovely little crime film directed by James Foley, but Walken is at his most threatening and empty-eyed and soulless, who will kill without hesitating if it means saving his skin. Supposedly based on a true story. It's a great Walken performance. It's a great wee film, and one of his best performances by his moustache. Next is The Jungle Book, where Christopher Walken plays King Louis, the massive orangutan. I love the 1967 Jungle Book, but I was actually quite surprised at how good this one is. I wasn't expecting much, but it's actually a really nice version. There's only a couple of songs, so it's not like full-blown musical. Obviously Walken gets to sing one of them. Yeah, it's actually a lot better than I thought it would be. I had very low expectations. Next is True Romance, and this, along with another Tarantino written project, is the perfect example of how good Walken can be in a small role. He's only in one scene in this film, which is famous and you all know what it is. Originally I think he was going to be in another couple of scenes, but they got cut. So he is just in the scene with Dennis Hopper, which is beautifully directed, really well written. Hopper and Walken are just bouncing off each other, and it's just a classic scene. The rest of the film's okay. I think it's a bit overrated. But let's be honest, not the only reason I've got it, but certainly the main reason I've got it is for Christopher Walken and Dennis Hopper. Next is one of the films that's probably the hardest to justify, 9 Lives, where Kevin Spacey gets transported into the body of a cat. Christopher Walken gives a nice little turn. Yeah, it's not good. And there's Pulp Fiction, with the obviously classic Christopher Walken watch speech. Again, the film itself is probably overrated. It's still very good, but it's not like the greatest film of the 90s as it's often cited as. But Walken, again, is a perfect example of how he can pretty much just almost walk away with a film despite being in it for one scene. Here we are with Prophecy, or Angeles Daimonos. Again, this is a silly genre film about the war in heaven between angels, and Christopher Walken plays the angel of death, Gabriel. It's got a great cast though. Eric Stoltz, Virginia Madsen, Elias Koteas. Viggo Mortensen is the devil before he became famous and hung about with dwarfs. But the reason this is such a good film, or I'm just biased obviously because it's got Walken in it, but Walken makes the angel of death, scary and intimidating, but also human. There's a great scene where Elias Koteas asks him, why don't you just ask God and whatever, and Christopher Walken just says, because he doesn't talk to me anymore. And you actually feel sorry for him. You actually feel sorry for the angel of death, and I don't think there's many actors that could pull that off. There's lots of brilliant one-liners in the film. It's complete genre cheese, but again, Walken just elevates it, and that's why for me he's one of America's greatest actors. And again, still underrated because he can take stuff that's perhaps not the best material, and he can just elevate it. He just makes it better. This is, I think, one of the films he did right after The Deer Hunter. This is Shoot the Sun Down, directed by David Leeds, who I'm not familiar with. This is a bizarre little western from 1978. It's a bit El Topo-ish. Obviously he's kind of like The Man with No Name. Margaret Kidder's in it, Jeffrey Lewis. But it's just a weird little strange film. It's hard to describe. It kind of works and also kind of doesn't. But it's an unusual film, and if you're a fan of Christopher Walken, I would recommend it. If you're a fan of westerns, I would recommend it, even though it is more of the kind of El Topo-ish type stuff rather than your conventional western. Next is Sleepy Hollow. This is a film where Christopher Walken doesn't actually speak. He's not actually in it that much. But when he's in it as the Headless Horseman, obviously in flashbacks with his head still on, he's fantastic. I mean, I'm not sure how many actors would actually take that role where they're not going to speak, but he does it with aplomb and gusto. Next is Paul Schrader's Comfort of Strangers. Again, I haven't seen this for a long time, so I need to watch it again. This BFI edition has a ton of extras. Commentary by Paul Schrader. The Paul Schrader Film Masterclass from 1982, which is 100 minutes long. There's an 85-minute Paul Schrader Guardian interview. There's just a whole bunch of stuff. I did pop it in to look at the print, and the print looks gorgeous, but I need to rewatch the film because it's been so long. Next is an essential Christopher Walken production if you're a Christopher Walken fan. It's Peter Pan Live. This was for NBC, where they actually did it live. And this has the soundtrack as well. So this is pretty much Christopher Walken's dream. He sings, he dances. I think he's got about 5 songs on the soundtrack where he sings. It's just priceless. If you're a Christopher Walken fan, or just a film fan in general, it's fantastic. I mean, the whole production is perhaps not the best Peter Pan, and when Christopher Walken's not on the screen, it's not quite as interesting. But when Walken's on the screen, he's just having an absolute blast. I mean, you can almost tell that he's just absolutely loving it. And he sings some killer tunes and he gets to dance. I mean, come on, it's essential viewing. Next, A View to a Kill. This is only one of 2 James Bond films I have. I'm not a James Bond fan, but Christopher Walken gives a moving performance as Max Zorin. He even has the line that includes the title of the film. It's just a wonderful little Christopher Walken performance. He's blonde in this one. Grace Jones gives great performance, as does Tawny Kitaen, and Roger Moore, who's far too old. It's Christopher Walken. Next is The Dogs of War, or The Dogs of War. I've got one Twilight Time and one from Eureka. This is another masterful Walken performance as another hollow man, as a mercenary. And when he's not in battle, he's almost like a shell who's just like walking about. But he gets involved in this plot to overthrow a despot in Africa and gets a crew together, including Tom Berenger. it's a really good little film, and Walken is just fantastic in it. The way he moves, the way he walks, the way he runs. And the last two films, you'll be glad to know, are Abel Ferrara films. One is King of New York, which is arguably Ferrara's finest work, where again Walken is Frank White, and he gets the leading role, which again just doesn't happen enough in Christopher Walken's career. He gets some great lines, he even gets an impromptu dance. He's threatening when he has to be, he's funny, it's a seminal Abel Ferrara film and a seminal Christopher Walken performance. If you haven't seen it, prepare to be impressed. It's a bit messy in places, but prepare to be impressed. And finally, The Addiction, another example of Christopher Walken not being in the film that much. He's only in it for a scene, 2 scenes, as the experienced vampire to Lily Taylor's novice. Shot at the same time as the funeral, they pretty much did them back to back. This one's in black and white. It's more about existentialism, vampirism, than your standard vampire film. But again, Christopher Walken turns up and just gives a great little performance, and then goes away again. So thank you very much for watching. I do admit to being a little bit biased towards Christopher Walken, and perhaps some of the films that I've shown you is an example of that. But please let me know in the comments which Christopher Walken films you like, which ones that I should have that I haven't got, because I think he's got about 130 credits or something. He's had a long career, and a fantastic one. So thanks very much for watching, and hopefully we'll see you again for another episode of In the Frame. This is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, stay safe, and farewell.